Good morning. My name's Sue Barclay. I am one of the tutors here at All Nations, where I teach contextual theology and mission studies. And I've been asked to speak to you today about this topic of why do we need to be able to teach some theology? Yes, we all need to have studied some theology ourselves, but why is teaching theology an important part of mission? Before I get launched into that, I just want to briefly point to the fact that All Nations is a great place to study these kinds of things and to be equipped for mission. My email's on the slide here. If you're interested in any of our programs, please email me and I'd be delighted to talk you through some of the training opportunities that we have here. Here is just a brief overview. You can study at all levels, from short intensive courses for people who are going very short term, right through to a 3-year degrees and MA and other postgrad options. We've recently had our MA programme revalidated by the Open University, and we now offer 8 different postgraduate awards, which are listed there: intercultural leadership, church, mission and world Christianity, diaspora and intercultural church, contextual theology, which is the one that I'm particularly involved in myself, and then a brand new MA in arts and intercultural worship. So if you're interested in any of those, please get in touch. The website is also there on the slide, so please have a look at the website, please get in touch, and I'll be delighted to talk to you about any of those opportunities. So why is it important for us to be able to teach theology? Here's a statement from the Cape Town Commitment. Cape Town Commitment is a particularly significant document for the missions community. I can sense some anxiety at the back. Am I not in the right place? Are we okay? Okay. It's a particularly important document for the missions community because it's the evangelical global evangelical community meeting together to talk about how to be God's people in the world, how to reach the world. And in their most recent major document... Good morning. My name's Sue Barclay. I am one of the tutors here at All Nations, where I teach contextual theology and mission studies. And I've been asked to speak to you today about this topic of why do we need to be able to teach some theology? Yes, we all need to have studied some theology ourselves, but why is teaching theology an important part of mission? Before I get launched into that, I just want to briefly point to the fact that All Nations is a great place to study these kinds of things and to be equipped for mission. My email's on the slide here. If you're interested in any of our programs, please email me and I'd be delighted to talk you through some of the training opportunities that we have here. Here is just a brief overview. You can study at all levels, from short intensive courses for people who are going very short term, right through to a 3-year degrees and MA and other postgrad options. We've recently had our MA programme revalidated by the Open University, and we now offer 8 different postgraduate awards, which are listed there: intercultural leadership, church, mission and world Christianity, diaspora and intercultural church, contextual theology, which is the one that I'm particularly involved in myself, and then a brand new MA in arts and intercultural worship. So if you're interested in any of those, please get in touch. The website is also there on the slide, so please have a look at the website, please get in touch, and I'll be delighted to talk to you about any of those opportunities. So why is it important for us to be able to teach theology? Here's a statement from the Cape Town Commitment. Cape Town Commitment is a particularly significant document for the missions community. I can sense some anxiety at the back. Am I not in the right place? Are we okay? Okay. It's a particularly important document for the missions community because it's the evangelical global evangelical community meeting together to talk about how to be God's people in the world, how to reach the world. And in their most recent major document, the Cape Town commitment, there's lots in there actually about the role of theological education, the role of teaching theology. And here's just a brief extract. The mission of the church on earth is to serve the mission of God. So we are here to serve the mission of God. The mission of theological education is to equip the church in its mission to serve the mission of God. So to strengthen and accompany the mission of the church. And they identify two key things that theological education does in all of that. First, it trains those who lead the church. And second, it equips all God's people. And it's actually the second of those that I want to major on today, because that's my passion, is how teaching people to think of themselves as theologically active, as people with a theological voice, whose theological views matter, is so empowering, so affirming, helping people to discover their own ability to think and talk and teach and learn about God. So we have the mission of God, the mission of church serving the mission of God, and teaching theology about equipping the church to serve the mission of God. Which leads to this question. So what then is the mission of the church? There are many different ways that we could answer that question. We could talk about thy kingdom come, about this need to be God's people in the world, the representatives of God's kingly rule in the world. We could talk about making Jesus known. We could talk about showing God's love and compassion in all different ways. But I want to focus on a particular aspect of the mission of the church, not the only aspect by any means, but a particular aspect, which is what we might call the mission imperative. And I'm drawing on two very familiar biblical verses here. Go and make disciples of all nations, says Jesus, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth, says Jesus. And I've highlighted three words or phrases from those two verses. Make disciples, be witnesses, to the ends of the earth. And I want to explore those a little bit when we talk about why it's important to teach theology. Here's a quote also from Andrew Walls, great missiologist who's informed our thinking in so many ways about how the gospel has spread around the world through history. And he makes the point that Christianity lives by crossing cultural frontiers. It never stays in one place forever. It's on the move. To illustrate that, here's a map from the Centre for World Christianity, I think that's the name, the Gordon Conwell Centre, anyway, mapping the trajectory of what they call the centre of gravity of Christianity. Now, notice we need to be careful about using words like centre, because those can have power connotations. We're not talking about the centre of power in the church, because there shouldn't be a centre of power. There is, but there shouldn't be. What we're talking about is the centre of gravity in the church. In other words, and the definition's there on the left, the place in the world where the number of Christians to the north and the south and to the east and the west is equal. So the kind of geographical centre of Christianity globally. And you can see that over the centuries that has migrated from Palestine, obviously at the beginning, through Asia Minor, through Eastern and Western Europe, and currently lies somewhere in West Africa. And that's the geographical centre of Christianity. And I use that illustration, and we could talk a lot about the limitations of that particular view and the benefits of that particular view. I use it to make this simple point. Christianity is on the move, and Christianity has always been on the move. And so one of the things we need to be thinking about when we teach theology is how to equip people for crossing cultural frontiers, how to equip people for the fact that we as Christians are always on the move. So Christianity is constantly encountering new cultures and contexts as it's on the move. And those new cultures and contexts demand new responses. The key question this leads to, in my view, is what is authentic Christianity in this new context? It's constantly on the move, constantly encountering new and changing contexts. Even the old contexts are changing. We only have to look at the changes in Europe and the West over the last 100 years. Massive cultural change. What is authentic Christianity in this context? And that is a theological question. So we need to teach theology in order to equip people to work out what authentic Christianity looks like in their particular context. When we talk about theology, we often talk about it as having 4 sources. Scripture, the Bible, learning how to read and understand and handle and preach the Bible. All of that is a massively central source for theology. So too is our reason, our ability to think, our ability to wrestle with ideas and think things through. So too is our tradition. For many of us, that may be the evangelical tradition. It may be a denominational tradition, which has given us some equipment for thinking theologically, a Baptist tradition, a Pentecostal tradition, whatever that might be. And so too is our experience, our life experience. We think theologically out of the people who we are, rooted in our own culture, rooted in our own life experience. And all of these are inputs into the theological process, which I think is best represented like this. You know, there's often all kinds of arguments and, you know, not quite punch-ups, but disputes. And, you know, you've only got to look at the history of the development of the creeds, for example, to see how violently people disagreed in the past. And, of course, that is still true. There are inputs into theology, but we don't necessarily all reach the same opinion as to what those inputs mean, what their consequences are. Theology is a process. It's a living, dynamic, active process based on these key inputs. And as we look at that fairly simplistic diagram of 4 inputs, 4 sources of theology, I think what I really want to point out today is that each one of them has context. And we can't think about any one of them without thinking about context. Our interpretation of Scripture is done in a context. One of the things we look at here is how, for instance, a Chinese reading of Scripture may be different from a Latin American reading of the same passage, which may be different from a Western European one, because we're working in different hermeneutical traditions. We're bringing that context and our background, our own cultural background, into identifying with the stories we see in the Bible. Our tradition obviously has a context. Our thought processes have a context. We are shaped by our cultures. We think in certain ways because of our cultures. I tend to think in Western ways because I'm a Western person. Other people think in very different ways because they come from other parts of the world. So our reason has a context. And of course our experience has a context. And all of those things need to be handled properly when we think theologically and we think about teaching theology and teaching people how to do theology in their context. So very briefly, what is theology? I want to offer this definition. You may have a different definition, but people thinking about God and about God's world. So we might talk about a theology of the created world, a theology of gender, a theology of I've said the environment, theology of various things in the world. We think about that from within our own cultural context. We think about that based on our interpretation of the Bible, based on our reading of the Bible, based on our tradition, based on our experience. All of those 4 sources are present when we do theology, when we think about God. And then we connect that thinking to our living. And one of the things that we emphasize here is the need for theological reflection to result in action, to result in response, to result in transformation. And so we connect that theological thinking to our living. Theology then is not just a set of doctrines that we learn, but it's an activity, a process of connecting doctrines, connecting ideas about God to the world that we live in. And it's something that is done by everyone, not just by priests, not just by academics, not just by Western men, but by everyone, whether they're trained or not. People can do good theology or bad theology. People will be thinking about God, and if they're not trained in thinking about God, they might be bringing in all kinds of misconceptions and doing that in a less than ideal way. Everyone does theology. Even those who are atheists do theology. They have views about God. The question is, how can we equip people to do theology well? And how can we equip people to do it with integrity? When we teach theology, we give people the tools to think in this way, to live joined up Christian lives which bring their faith into connection with their world, into connection with their own mission. We affirm their theological voices when we do this. Just as an example, here's an illustration of the story of Jesus encountering the Samaritan woman at the well. And one of the things I love about that story is that he affirms her theological voice. He treats her as a theologically responsible person, a spiritually and morally responsible person. He talks to her about her views of God. What do you think? Why do you worship here? I know what you worship, etc., etc. He's treating her as someone he can have a theological conversation with. And through that conversation comes transformation. It's an affirming conversation. It's one that respects her as a theological agent, even though she comes from a different culture. So then, our sources of theology have a context. And it's really important to be aware when we think about theology, when we do theology, that all theology is contextual. Here is a statement from Stephen Bevans, one of our core texts for the contextual theology programme here. He says, and this is the very first paragraph of his book, there is no such thing as theology, as if it's a monolithic thing that's the same for everybody. There is only contextual theology. And then he goes on to outline all the different types of theology that he could think of. And then he says, the contextualization of theology, the attempt to understand faith in terms of a particular context, is really a theological imperative. Elsewhere in his writing, he says, if we don't do that, then what we've got is something that's irrelevant. It may be well, kind of developed and elegant and well constructed, but if it's not actually connected to context, then nobody's life is going to be changed by that, and it becomes irrelevant. He says here in this particular book, the contextualization of theology is a process that is part of the very nature of theology itself. How do we connect it to the places that we live in? And that's one of the skills that we need to equip people with when we teach. So why do we do theology? To increase our understanding of God. It will lead us into worship as we understand God more. It will equip us for partnership in God's mission. It will help us connect our faith and our practice, and it will lead to transformative action in the world. Theology is not just an esoteric academic discipline. Theology matters to Christian life in the world. When we do theology, there is a set of things we need to think about in terms of how we do theology. And I could equally well have entitled this slide, How Do We Teach Theology? The same things apply. We want to be doing theology ethically. Here's some of the ethical questions that might be raised when we think about how to do it. Who is allowed to do theology? Who is doing it? Who is being heard? Who is not being heard? Whose voice is loud? Whose voice is completely ignored? Who is affected by our theological thinking? Who is implicated in some of the theological ideas that we come up with? Who should respond? These are power questions. These are ethical questions. And when we teach theology, we bring these things in, just as when we do it. We're also interested in doing theology servant-heartedly, for the sake of the church. Hospitably. What do I mean by that? Well, here's an illustration from our Christmas dinner this year. A hospitable table with a place laid for everybody. everyone welcome, everyone contributing something to the feast, everyone sharing the food together. That metaphor, that illustration raises questions, everything does, about whose table it is, who's the host and who's the guest. And ideally what we're looking for is a place of sharing, a place of communication. We do theology prayerfully, we do it as worship, we do it to point to God. All of these things are true of how we teach theology, as well as how we do theology ourselves as individual believers and as churches. We could think of others. It's just a brief, off the top of my head list, but we could populate this slide with lots of other things about how we need to do theology. So returning to the Lausanne statement on the mission of the church, the mission of theological education, let's focus in on these verbs: to strengthen, to accompany, to train, and to equip. And I want to look at how we do these, why it's important that we teach theology with a view to these, by returning to that mission imperative: go and make disciples of all nations, etc. Teaching theology helps to equip the church for this task. Starting with the first one, make disciples. Why teach theology? Because it equips people to be disciples. You know, if people become confident, feel affirmed in their own theological voice, become respected as people with theological opinions, that's an empowering and inspiring thing. That takes local believers out of a position of dependence on the person who's, you know, perhaps come in as a church planter or who is the pastor or whatever, and gives them that new vision. God speaks our language. God understands our culture. God knows and loves our culture. God is present here in our world. It's a tremendously affirming thing to do, is to help people to see that they have a theological voice and that it's important for them to think theologically and to study theology. Equipping for discipleship, by teaching theology, we also show that Christianity is not a foreign religion. We're helping people to think contextually, to theologize contextually in their own setting. And it's in their worldview, in their mental structures, in their language. It's also equipping people to inhabit their own cultural context with integrity and authenticity. How should I live in this context? That's a theological question. What does my faith have to do with this context? That's a theological question. We're equipping people for living joined up Christian lives. So when we teach theology, we empower and equip people to think theologically about their own lives. It matters. Second point, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem. Teaching theology helps to equip the church for this task. Equipping for witness. By teaching theology, we are providing a framework for local believers to think theologically about the missional challenges of their own cultural context. Help them to think through, what are the key gospel themes? To know that, to be confident in what the key gospel themes are. What have Christians understood by them in other places and at other times? As was shown in that earlier image, we draw on a heritage of thousands of years of theological thought. What has that got to teach us? Here and now, in this context where we as a church are situated, what would be good news for us and for our community? How would that be expressed in our particular situation? How can we communicate it to our neighbours? So by teaching theology, we're equipping people for witness that is effective, relevant, contextualised. We empower and equip people to think missionally in their own context. And then thirdly, to the ends of the earth. Teaching theology helps to equip the church for this task, equipping people for crossing cultural frontiers. We're helping people when we teach theology to engage with other people's perspectives. They might be reading theology or listening to theology that comes from another perspective. They might be thinking about how that translates to their own. We're helping people to engage with mission to their own people alongside with their own people, but also through and beyond their own people to others in other cultural contexts, widening that vision, teaching those skills of contextualisation. And as we equip people with the confidence that they can self-theologise, that leads on to self-missiologising, thinking about mission for themselves, not relying on the missionary to do their theology for them, not relying on the missionary to do their missiology for them, but equipping them with the skills to do these things for themselves. It's an empowering, equipping, affirming ministry when we teach theology. So a local believer might be thinking, well, based on my growing knowledge of God, based on my growing practice of joined-up living, how can I now hear this commission myself and reach people beyond my community? And as we teach theology, we equip the church for this. We equip people with a broader vision of God's work in the world and their part in it. So, final slide. Why do we teach theology? For me, my particular passion for why we teach theology is to equip the church to do it for themselves, to take away that dependence and to affirm people as theological thinkers, theological agents, people who are theologically active for themselves.